Eleanor Graves never thought she'd set foot in Blackwood again. The small town, nestled deep in the Appalachian wilderness, was a place of whispered legends and shadowed pasts. She had spent her childhood there, growing up in the looming specter of Holloway House, the place where her family once lived and where her mother had disappeared without a trace when Eleanor was only 10 years old. Now, 20 years later, she was back. Her mother's case had never been solved. The town had whispered of ghosts, of curses, of things that lurked in the walls. Eleanor's father had never spoken of it, had simply packed them up and left Holloway House behind, pretending it never existed. But when the news came that her father had died, leaving the house in her name, she had no choice but to return. The house stood at the end of a winding road, surrounded by ancient oaks whose branches clawed at the sky. It was larger than she remembered, its dark stone exterior weathered by time. The windows gaped like empty eyes, and as Eleanor stepped onto the porch, the wind carried a sound, a whisper, soft and unintelligible. Slipping through the cracks in the wood, she hesitated before pushing the door open. The scent of damp wood and dust hit her instantly. The house was cold, unnaturally so, as if no warmth had touched it in years. Then, from somewhere inside, came the sound of footsteps. Eleanor froze, her heart hammering. The sound was faint but distinct. Slow, deliberate steps moving across the floor above her. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to be rational. It was an old house. It creaked and groaned with the wind, but then she heard it again. Closer this time, she moved cautiously, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The furniture was covered in white sheets, resembling shrouded figures. The grand staircase stretched before her, leading into the gloom above. As she reached the top, the whispering began. Soft voices, too quiet to make out, slithered through the air. They came from the walls, from the floorboards, from the very bones of the house. Eleanor's breath hitched, and then something laughed. It was low and breathy, brushing against her ear like a cold wind. She spun around, but the hallway behind her was empty. The bedroom door at the end of the hall was slightly ajar. That had been her mother's room. Eleanor hesitated before stepping forward. The air grew heavier, pressing against her like unseen hands. The whispering intensified, rising in pitch, urgent and desperate. She pushed the door open. The room was untouched, frozen in time. A dust-covered mirror stood against the wall, reflecting a warped image of the room. Eleanor's gaze flickered to the bed, where something lay beneath the sheets. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she reached for the fabric. With trembling fingers, she pulled it back. There was nothing there, only an imprint in the dust, as if someone had been lying there moments before. A shudder ran through her. Then in the mirror, she saw something move. Not her reflection, something else. Eleanor stumbled backward, her pulse thundering in her ears. The figure in the mirror was still there, a tall, thin shadow with hollow eyes. It stood motionless, watching her. Then it whispered her name. She gasped, spinning to face the room, but there was nothing, only silence. She ran down the stairs, through the hallway, but the house shifted. The walls seemed to stretch, the doors elongated, twisting into impossible angles. The whispering followed her, growing louder, more urgent. Then, just as suddenly, the house stilled. Eleanor stood at the front door, her hands shaking as she grasped the handle. The whispering had stopped. The silence was absolute. And then, from behind her came a voice she had not heard in 20 years. "Eleanor?" She turned slowly. Her mother stood at the foot of the stairs. She looked exactly as she had the day she vanished, unchanged, untouched by time. Tears filled Eleanor's eyes. "Mom," her mother smiled, but it was wrong. Her lips curled too wide, her teeth too sharp. Her eyes were black voids, hungry and endless. "You shouldn't have come back," she whispered. The walls around them groaned. The house trembled. Shadows slithered from the corners, crawling toward Eleanor. Her mother reached out a hand, her fingers elongating, stretching unnaturally. "Come, sweetheart, let's finish what we started." Eleanor screamed. The last thing she heard before the darkness swallowed her whole was the whispering, soft and ceaseless, calling her name over and over again. Holloway House had claimed another soul.